The midnight train. Evan was an insomniac. Not the kind that tosses and turns for hours before drifting off. He hadn't had a proper night's sleep in years. His therapist suggested all the usual tricks: meditation, journaling, even medication. Nothing worked. But lately, his sleepless nights had taken on a strange new pattern. Every night at exactly 2:47 a.m., Evan would hear the distant sound of a train whistle. It didn't make sense. He didn't live near train tracks, and as far as he knew, the closest railway was miles away. At first, he thought it was just his imagination. Some trick his mind was playing on him in the fog of exhaustion. But the sound persisted. Every night, the same low, mournful whistle, followed by the faint rumble of wheels on tracks. One night, unable to ignore it any longer, Evan decided to investigate. He threw on a jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and headed out into the cool, misty air. The streets were empty, silent except for the occasional hum of a distant car. He followed the sound of the whistle, walking further than he'd intended. It was faint but consistent, always pulling him forward. Eventually, he found himself at an overgrown field on the edge of town. In the middle of the field, cutting through the tall grass, was a set of rusted train tracks. Evan frowned. He'd never seen them before, and they certainly weren't on any map. The whistle blew again, louder now, and the ground beneath him began to vibrate. He turned to look down the tracks, and his heart skipped a beat. Emerging from the fog was a train, an old-fashioned locomotive, its headlights piercing through the mist. It looked ancient, its black metal covered in grime and soot. Evan stepped back as the train screeched to a halt in front of him. The doors creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior. For a moment he thought it was empty, but then a figure appeared in the doorway, a tall man in a tattered conductor's uniform. His face was gaunt, pale, and expressionless. "Ticket?" the conductor asked, his voice flat. "I don't have a ticket," Evan stammered. "I wasn't expecting this." The conductor tilted his head slightly, as if considering Evan's words. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, yellowed ticket. "First ride is free," he said, handing it over. Evan hesitated. Everything in him screamed to turn around and walk away, but something about the train, about the conductor, felt magnetic, like he couldn't refuse. He stepped onto the train, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet. The interior was dim and smelled of damp wood and old smoke. The seats were empty, but the air felt heavy, like the train was full of unseen passengers. Evan chose a seat near the window and clutched the ticket in his hand. The train lurched forward, the wheels screeching against the tracks. Evan stared out the window, expecting to see the field, the town, anything familiar. But all he saw was darkness. No stars, no moon, just an endless void. "Where are we going?" he asked the conductor, who was now standing at the front of the car. "To where you belong," the conductor replied without turning around. Evan's stomach churned. "What does that mean?" The conductor didn't answer. Instead, he began walking down the aisle, his footsteps echoing loudly. As he passed each seat, shadows began to appear, faint, human-shaped figures that flickered like static on an old TV. They grew clearer, more solid, until the car was full of passengers. Their faces were blank, their eyes hollow, but they all seemed to be staring at him. Panic surged through Evan. He stood, gripping the back of his seat. "Let me off. I don't want to be here." The conductor turned to face him, his expression unchanged. "You boarded the train, Evan. The journey must be completed." Evan's mind raced. How did the conductor know his name? Why did this feel so final? The train began to slow, the screech of the brakes filling the car. Evan turned to look out the window, desperate to see where they were. The darkness was fading, replaced by a landscape that made his blood run cold. It was a graveyard. The train pulled up to a platform that jutted out into the cemetery. The conductor gestured toward the door. "Your stop." "No," Evan said, backing away. "I'm not getting off." The conductor's face twisted into a smile, a cold, unnatural grin. "Evan, you've been riding this train for years. You just didn't know it. It's time." The passengers began to rise, their movements jerky and unnatural. They reached for him, their hands cold and solid. Evan screamed, fighting to break free, but their grip was unrelenting. They pulled him toward the door, toward the platform, toward the rows of gravestones waiting in the mist. As he crossed the threshold, Evan's vision blurred. The last thing he saw was his name, etched into one of the gravestones, with a date that matched the night he first heard the train whistle. The next morning, the field was empty. No tracks, no train, no sign of Evan. All that remained was a faint whistle in the distance, fading into the mist. Thanks for stepping into the unknown with us. If this story gave you chills, hit that like button, drop a comment with your favorite twist, and don't forget to subscribe, because the best stories always have another chapter waiting. See you in the shadows.